He stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, tugging nervously at his decades-old black suit. Frank Winters took a deep breath as crystal chandeliers cast their gleaming light across marble floors. His weathered hands, marked with the honest calluses of a lifetime fixing engines, trembled slightly as he presented his invitation to the usher. "You must be mistaken, sir," the usher said, eyeing Frank's simple appearance with barely concealed disdain. "The service entrance is around back." "I'm the father of the groom," Frank replied quietly, his voice steady despite the embarrassment coloring his cheeks. The usher's eyes widened in surprise before he reluctantly stepped aside. Frank could feel the stares as he walked through the sea of designer dresses and tailored tuxedos. Whispers followed him like shadows. "That's Matthew's father, the mechanic?" Richard Thompson, the father of the bride, intercepted Frank before he could find his seat. His expensive cologne announced his presence before his words did. "Frank," Richard said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I think there's been a confusion with the seating arrangement. The family should be up front, but given the circumstances, perhaps you'd be more comfortable sitting in the back corner." Frank felt his heart sink as Richard gestured toward a solitary chair, separated from the rest of the guests by an obvious gap. The message was clear. He didn't belong. "Of course," Frank muttered, moving toward his isolated seat. As he settled into the chair, Frank noticed how the other guests deliberately avoided the empty seats surrounding him. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, offering them to everyone except Frank. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. The wedding planner bustled about, checking final arrangements. When her eyes landed on Frank, a flicker of confusion crossed her face before she hurried over to Richard, whispering something in his ear. Richard glanced back at Frank and shrugged dismissively. Frank checked his watch. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and something told him this day was about to take an unexpected turn. Frank Winters had never sought recognition for anything he'd done. His small auto repair shop on Maple Street had been his livelihood for over 40 years, a modest establishment with oil-stained concrete floors and walls decorated with calendars from parts suppliers and faded photographs of cars he'd restored. The scent of motor oil and coffee permeated every corner, creating a comfort that luxury could never replicate. But to those who knew him well, Frank's true legacy had nothing to do with the engines he repaired. Robert Lawrence, a retired Army sergeant, still remembered the day he'd stumbled into Frank's shop. Fresh from his third tour in Afghanistan, Robert's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his car keys. The backfiring of a truck had sent him diving for cover in the middle of Main Street. Humiliated and desperate, he'd pushed his broken-down sedan into the nearest garage. "I don't have much money," Robert had admitted, eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of his pride making it difficult to look up. Frank had noticed the military tags hanging from Robert's keychain and the 1,000-yard stare he recognized all too well. He'd seen that same hollow look in his father's eyes decades ago. "When did you get back?" Frank had asked quietly, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. 3 weeks ago," Robert answered, surprised by the question. Frank nodded, understanding everything that wasn't being said. "The car's on the house, and if you're not busy Tuesday evenings, a few of us meet in the back room, just to talk." That was how it started. Frank Willard Winters, the son of a Korean War veteran who'd never quite found his way home, had created something extraordinary in the back of his repair shop. What began as informal gatherings with coffee and donuts evolved into a sanctuary for hundreds of veterans over 4 decades. The back room of Winters Auto Repair had walls lined with mismatched chairs and an old coffee maker that ran continuously. There were no credentials on the wall, no certificates or degrees, just a space where the burden of trauma could be temporarily set down. Frank never called it therapy, just shooting the breeze, but the veterans who gathered there found something medications and official programs couldn't provide. They found understanding from a man who listened more than he spoke, who taught them to work with their hands when their minds became too loud, who helped them rebuild their lives while they helped him rebuild engines. When Captain James Miller returned from Desert Storm, unable to sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time, it was in Frank's shop that he finally found rest, dozing off in a battered armchair, while Frank quietly worked on a transmission nearby. When specialist Sarah Reeves couldn't bear to be touched after what happened on her tour, it was Frank who taught her to channel her focus into rebuilding a '67 Mustang, one careful movement at a time. When Frank's wife Martha was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago, these same veterans organized a rotation to drive her to treatments, mow their lawn, and bring homemade meals. They sat with Frank during those final days, a silent honor guard for the woman who had supported his mission for so many years. "Your work isn't finished, Frank," Martha had whispered during their last conversation, her hand frail, but her eyes clear. "They still need you." Frank's son Matthew had grown up watching his father's quiet service, even as he chose a different path: law school, a corporate career, and now marriage into one of the city's most prominent families. Matthew understood his father's work, but few others in his new social circle seemed to grasp the depth of what Frank had built. In the enormous ballroom, Frank shifted uncomfortably on his chair, feeling every bit the outsider. He watched as seats filled around the room, everywhere except the empty circle surrounding him. Richard Thompson's orchestration was clear: keep the old mechanic isolated, a visual footnote at his own son's wedding. Frank ran a finger along his collar, the starched fabric feeling foreign against his neck. His suit, purchased decades ago for his own wedding, hung slightly loose on his frame. Martha would have noticed, would have insisted on alterations, but Frank hadn't thought it important enough. From across the room, Frank caught his son's eye. Matthew stood tall in his tuxedo, looking torn between family obligations. Frank gave him a small nod, permission to focus on his bride and her family. The boy had worked hard for this life. Frank wouldn't tarnish his moment. Earlier that morning, while polishing his old dress shoes, Frank had found himself staring at his reflection, his face mapped with lines from years of concentration under car hoods, hands permanently stained with traces of oil no amount of scrubbing could remove. He'd heard Richard once refer to him as the grease monkey when he thought Frank wasn't within earshot. Was it worth it? Frank had whispered to his reflection, a question he'd never allowed himself to ask aloud. 40 years of staying late to fix a single mother's car for whatever she could afford. Countless nights spent talking veterans through their darkest moments instead of building his business. The promotions he'd turned down at the dealership because they would have meant closing his shop, the only safe space some of those men and women had. Frank watched as Richard worked the room, slapping backs and shaking hands. His daughter Jessica was marrying into a proper family, on her father's side at least, a family with connections and pedigree. Frank was the inconvenient truth, the working-class stain on their perfect union. A waiter approached everyone else with champagne, but bypassed Frank entirely. A woman in an expensive dress looked directly at him, then deliberately chose a seat 3 rows away, rather than the empty ones beside him. Frank remembered how his own father had felt returning from Korea, invisible yet conspicuous, both at once. Something shifted inside him. Not anger. Frank had never been an angry man, but a profound sadness. Perhaps Martha had been wrong. Perhaps his work was finished after all, rendered meaningless in a world that valued appearance over substance. Frank found himself wondering if he should leave. He could slip out quietly, call his son later to explain. No one would miss his presence. In fact, Richard would probably be relieved. As he contemplated his exit, a young server, different from the others, approached with a glass of water. "Sir," she said quietly, leaning down as if sharing a secret, "are you Mr. Winters, the mechanic from Maple Street?" Frank nodded, surprised to be recognized. "My brother Tommy served in Iraq," she whispered, her eyes darting to ensure no one overheard. "He said I should thank you if I ever met you. Said you saved his life, though he wouldn't tell me how." Before Frank could respond, the girl was called away by a stern-looking supervisor. But that brief moment, that single acknowledgement, straightened his shoulders slightly. Outside the ballroom windows, he noticed a dark sedan pull up, then another. Something was happening in the parking lot, though from his isolated seat, Frank couldn't quite make it out. He saw men in dark suits emerging from the vehicles, moving with a particular kind of discipline he recognized immediately. The wedding coordinator announced that the ceremony would begin in 5 minutes. Guests began taking their seats, the empty chairs around Frank becoming even more conspicuous as the room filled. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering Martha's favorite saying, "True worth isn't announced with trumpets, Frank. It walks quietly through the back door when you least expect it." As if on cue, the back doors of the ballroom opened. The large wooden doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open with military precision. Conversations halted mid-sentence. As heads turned, Frank squinted, trying to see what had captured everyone's attention. A tall man in a decorated army dress uniform stepped forward. Behind him stood rows of uniformed soldiers, some young with polished buttons and erect postures, others older with chests bearing the weight of medals and memories. They moved as one, a sea of pressed uniforms and disciplined steps. The lead officer scanned the room until his eyes locked with Frank's. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he recognized General James Roberts, once a broken young lieutenant who'd appeared at his shop doorstep 25 years ago with engine trouble and invisible wounds. "Attention!" the general commanded, his voice filling the ballroom. The soldiers behind him snapped to perfect formation. Richard Thompson stepped forward, confusion and irritation battling on his face. "Excuse me, but what is the meaning of this interruption? We're about to begin a wedding ceremony." The general's expression remained impassive. "We're well aware, sir. We're here for Frank Winters." A murmur rippled through the guests. Matthew stepped away from his groomsmen, moving toward the center of the room, his expression a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding. "For those who don't know," the general continued, his voice carrying to every corner, 40 years ago, Frank Winters created a haven for veterans when the rest of the world had forgotten us. Without funding, without recognition, without asking anything in return." Frank felt heat rising to his face as every eye in the room turned toward him. "My name is General James Roberts. The man sitting alone in that corner saved my life when I came home from Desert Storm ready to end it. There are 50 of us here today, just a fraction of the hundreds he's helped. We're here because we received word that Frank Winters was sitting alone at his son's wedding, and that simply will not stand." With another command, the soldiers moved forward in perfect formation, each taking a seat in the empty chairs surrounding Frank. Within moments, the isolated corner transformed into an island of decorated uniforms, with Frank at its center. A soldier Frank recognized as former Corporal Michael Chen leaned over and whispered, "We would have been here sooner, sir, but we had to track down everyone available on short notice. The others send their regrets." Frank found himself surrounded by men and women whose broken pieces he had helped gather over the years. Lieutenant Sarah Reeves, now a clinical psychologist working with trauma survivors, Captain David Miller, who'd overcome his addiction and now ran a rehabilitation program, Sergeant Taylor Williams, who'd once planned his suicide in Frank's back room, but now coached youth basketball and had 3 children. The whispers in the room changed tone completely. Frank could see guests leaning toward each other, asking questions, pointing discreetly. The uniformed soldiers sat at attention, a living testament to Frank's impact. Matthew approached, shaking hands with each veteran, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Dad," he said, voice cracking slightly, "you never told me there would be so many." "I didn't know," Frank replied honestly. "I never kept count." General Roberts placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "That's because Frank never saw us as numbers or cases. We were just people to him, people who needed a little help finding our way back." The wedding coordinator appeared, clipboard clutched to her chest, clearly unsure how to proceed with this unexpected development. She glanced nervously between Richard Thompson and the uniformed contingent. "The ceremony," she began hesitantly. "Will proceed exactly as planned," Richard interjected, his voice strained as he tried to maintain control of the situation. But the balance of power had shifted. The isolated mechanic was now at the center of a formation that commanded respect by its very nature. The guests who had avoided Frank now stared with newfound curiosity, reevaluating the man they had so quickly dismissed. If you've been enjoying this powerful story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week that remind us of the extraordinary impact ordinary people can have. Click the subscribe button now to join our community of viewers who appreciate the deeper meaning in life's unexpected moments. Now, let's continue with this remarkable story. Richard Thompson stood frozen, champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips as the soldiers settled into their seats. His carefully orchestrated seating plan, designed to minimize Frank's presence, had backfired spectacularly. Now, the old mechanic commanded the most attention in the room, surrounded by an honor guard of decorated veterans. The wedding coordinator approached Richard, whispering urgently about the schedule and seating arrangements. Richard nodded mechanically, his eyes never leaving Frank and his unexpected entourage. The dynamic of the entire event had shifted in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Matthew approached his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You should have told me they were coming." Frank shook his head, genuine surprise in his eyes. "I had no idea." General Roberts stepped forward again. "Matthew didn't know because Frank never tells anyone what he does. That's who your father is. The night before my first command, when I was paralyzed with fear about leading men into combat, he stayed up until dawn talking me through it. Never mentioned it to anyone. That's been his way for 40 years. A woman in her early 30s in a captain's uniform stood, My name is Captain Rebecca Torres. 9 years ago, I was ready to surrender my commission because of what happened during my deployment. Mr. Winters didn't just fix my car, he fixed my perspective. He showed me how to rebuild my purpose piece by piece, just like an engine. Another soldier rose. Staff Sergeant James Wilson. When I couldn't afford my daughter's medical bills, Mr. Winters not only kept my truck running so I could work 2 jobs, but he also organized a silent fundraiser among the veterans community. My daughter is in college now because of him. One by one, the soldiers stood to offer brief testimonials, each story revealing another facet of Frank's quiet impact. The guests listened in stunned silence, witnessing the unveiling of a man they had dismissed as just a simple mechanic. From across the room, Jessica, Matthew's bride, stepped forward in her elegant white gown. Her eyes moved from the soldiers to Frank, then to her own father. Something unspoken passed between father and daughter before she walked purposefully toward Frank. "Mr. Winters," she said, reaching for his weathered hand, "would you do me the honor of walking me down the aisle alongside my father?" A hush fell over the room. Richard's face flushed, first with anger, then with something more complex, as he watched his daughter stand before this man he'd dismissed so easily. One of the older veterans stood up. "Excuse me, miss. My name is Sergeant Douglas Miller. Your future father-in-law saved more lives than any combat medic I ever served with. Different kind of battlefield, but the same results. There's no one more deserving to walk beside you." Richard Thompson approached slowly, his carefully constructed worldview visibly crumbling. He looked at the decorated soldiers, at his daughter's resolute expression, at Frank's humble demeanor, even in this moment of vindication. I've made a terrible mistake," Richard said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "Frank, I owe you an apology." Frank stood, straightening his simple suit jacket. "No apologies needed today. This is about these 2 young people." He gestured toward Matthew and Jessica. "That's all that matters." The wedding coordinator, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quietly rearranged the ceremony. As music began to play, Frank found himself in a position he never expected, at the front of the procession. The soldiers stood at attention as he passed, a silent salute to the man who had rebuilt their lives piece by piece, much as he rebuilt engines, with patience, skill, and an understanding that sometimes the most important parts are the ones nobody sees. Matthew embraced his father before taking his position at the altar. "I've always been proud of you, Dad," he whispered. "Always." As the ceremony proceeded, the divide in the room had dissolved. The guests who had earlier avoided Frank now watched him with new eyes, seeing for the first time the man beneath the mechanic's humble exterior. Richard Thompson stood beside Frank during the vows, 2 fathers united in love for their children, if nothing else. And when the chaplain spoke of commitment and service, every veteran in the room turned their gaze to Frank Winters, the embodiment of those very words. Sometimes the most profound truths arrive without announcement. They slip in quietly, rearranging our understanding when we least expect it. As the reception began, the distinction between guests blurred. Decorated generals conversed with corporate executives. Young soldiers danced with bridesmaids. And at a table near the center, no longer relegated to the corner, sat Frank Winters, surrounded by both his families, the son who carried his name and the veterans who carried his influence in their hearts. Richard Thompson approached Frank's table, humility having replaced his earlier arrogance. He sat down, struggling to find the right words. "You know," Frank said, breaking the awkward silence, "my father was a lot like you, concerned with appearances, worried about what others thought. It took him years to understand that the oil under my fingernails wasn't a mark of shame, but a badge of honest work." Richard nodded slowly. "I judged you without knowing you. Worse, I taught my daughter to value the wrong things." "No," Frank replied, watching Jessica laugh with Matthew across the room. "You raised a daughter who recognized the truth when she saw it. That's good parenting where I come from." Frank thought back to the countless hours in his shop, the coffee-fueled conversations, the slow healing that happened between oil changes and brake repairs. He'd never sought recognition for any of it. The work itself had been enough, the privilege of witnessing broken spirits mend, of being trusted with the darkest moments and the gradual returns to light. "I spent my life building things people couldn't see," Frank continued, his voice soft but steady. "You built things everyone could admire, different paths but neither wrong if done with integrity." Richard's eyes glistened. "I built hollow things, beautiful but hollow. It's never too late to fill them with something that matters," Frank replied. As evening fell, General Roberts tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted as he stood. "In the military," he began, "we present medals for acts of valor, but some forms of courage never receive official recognition. Frank Winters never wore a uniform, but he stood sentry for hundreds of us when we couldn't stand for ourselves." The general motioned to Sergeant Miller, who approached with a small wooden box. "This is long overdue, Frank. It's not from the government, it's from us." Inside lay a simple medallion, crafted from parts of vehicles Frank had repaired over decades, a spark plug from Miller's truck, a valve from Robert's first car, pieces contributed by veterans spanning 40 years of quiet service. "Our lives were in pieces," Roberts continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped us rebuild, one part at a time." Frank accepted the medallion with trembling hands, the weight of it representing so much more than metal. He thought of Martha, how she would have loved to witness this moment, not for the recognition, but for the confirmation that their life's purpose had mattered. As the celebration continued around him, Frank found himself beside Matthew and Jessica. His son looked at him with new understanding, not just as his father, but as a man whose legacy would echo through generations. "Dad," Matthew said, "I've been offered a position with the Veterans Legal Alliance. I was going to turn it down for something more prestigious, but after today," Frank smiled. Some lessons couldn't be taught, only witnessed. Later, as Frank prepared to leave, he found Richard waiting by the door. "The world needs more men like you, Frank," Richard said, extending his hand. "Men who measure success not by wealth accumulated, but by lives touched." Frank shook his hand firmly. "The world has plenty of them, Richard. They're just not always sitting in the seats you've been watching." As he stepped into the evening air, Frank found the 50 soldiers formed in 2 lines, creating a path for him. They stood at attention, a final salute to the quiet mechanic who had given them back their purpose. In that moment, Frank remembered the question he'd asked his reflection that morning. Was it worth it? The answer stood before him in perfect formation, not in medals or recognition, but in lives renewed, in purpose restored, in hope rekindled. Some men build fortunes, others build skyscrapers. Frank Winters built something far more enduring. He built people, one broken spirit at a time. And in a world that often overlooks the quiet craftsman of compassion, 50 soldiers stood as living monuments to a truth we too easily forget, that the measure of a life well lived is not found in the wealth we accumulate or the status we achieve, but in the lives we touch and the hearts we heal along the way. If this story touched your heart, there's another one waiting that might move you even more.